Hello, and thanks for joining us. I'm here today with a mother from Alberta who has been dealing with issues around trans identity in the home. And given that Danielle Smith just put out a new policy in Alberta, I thought it was a good time to have a chat with my mother and friend here. Do you want to maybe introduce yourself a little bit and talk about some of the things that you've been dealing with at home?
Yeah, sure. I found it to be quite timely for me actually right now to have this discussion, like you say, as a result of the announcement that has come out of Alberta here. In my particular case, the experience with my child began about 2.5 years ago now. Actually close to 3 years, and started much like I think a lot of these stories do, where our children come out to us as trans identified. In my case, like many others, really truthfully came out of the blue. Certainly no other expressions that would otherwise have led me to believe that there was any gender questioning really up until that point. And at that point, my child was just entering into grade 10, and had a friend that had transitioned the year prior, socially transitioned. But I was still pretty fresh to this, like most people, unless you're living it. It's not something that you're spending a lot of time researching. And so, being the liberal type parent that I am, I'm like, oh, okay, kiddo, we'll talk about it. Um, and you start getting into the pronoun situation and the name change and all of those sort of social transitional cues that they bring to the table, and often I would arguably say demand that you adhere to. But I sort of danced around that a little bit, really trying not to misgender and or affirm, if that makes sense. Just keeping it as neutral as possible in conversation, referring to my child as kiddo rather than their given name or their chosen name. And that certainly caught, some rocky time for us in terms of the relationship. But for the most part, we were navigating that reasonably well. And in terms of social transition, as far as pronouns, the school, my child's school actually did send out a letter for consent from high school. Um, and because at that point I was not super concerned about social transitioning, it was just yet another phase I believe that my kid was going through, because my child often went through very distinct phases. And so in that regard, wearing makeup and different changes of clothing, again, for me, it wasn't really that big of a deal. Not alarming, being again the type of parent and individual that I am. So we kind of carried through with the social piece of it, as much as I could adhere to. And then fast forward, not that long after, my child started asking about cross-sex hormones, which I was alarmed. I'm like, whoa.
So just to clarify, you just sorry to interrupt. Just to clarify, so you were talking about makeup. So that is a boy who's
Yes.
transitioning to a woman or a
Yeah,
girl.
a female,
Um,
female identifying. Yeah.
and you also said that you received a consent form, which I've had the pleasure of pleasure. I don't know if it call it
Mhm.
that, but I've had the opportunity to many parents with some podcasts that I did in the past, and every single one of them said that there was a transition that happened, but they weren't informed. And so I just thought that was curious because that's the first time I've heard that there was consent. So was this a couple of years ago?
This was yeah. So my child's in grade 12, just about to graduate. So and this is in grade 10. So yeah, a couple years ago, two and a half
Yeah.
years. Yeah, yeah. So
Where were we? I cut you off. Yeah.
yeah, no, that's okay. Yeah, no, and I think that's an important point to make, because I don't. I think that also points out to that it's either a school by school situation where some schools will take different approach. But and that in part, honestly, though, could have been that my at that point my child didn't think that I would not consent, or you know, it could have been a number of things. But I did actually sign a letter for the pronoun change. for the
Okay.
high school that my child attends here in Calgary. Uh, so that was a kind of a non-starter. There was nothing to really debate there with my kid. And then when the request for the hormones came up fairly quickly afterwards, I'm like, no, that's a hard no for me at this point. But they kept asking about it, and so my approach was delay, delay, delay. Let's just get as much puberty, get as much brain development maturity as we can. Sure, let's talk about this, but there's no major decision.
Can I ask why was that your instinct to delay? If you were happy with the transition, that was fine. Why have the instinct to say, okay, we need to pause this?
Because my line in the sand was always medical transition. So I knew that the more puberty this child went through, even if they decided to move forward with any kind of cross-sex hormones, that the puberty blockers would essentially be moot.
Does that mean that you did some research on it, that you looked into it, or did you just know this?
Oh no! And the second my kid came out in grade 10, I did a deep dive into the research, very very heavily researched. So I immediately, I did not take this lightly, because as much as I'm making it sound not a big deal, it was a big deal. But I kept thinking to myself, this too shall pass. But I need to be as informed as I can, because I can see where this is heading. I had hoped that it wouldn't head in that direction, but it clearly did. So yeah, and when I say I did research, we argue about this all the time on the internet and social media. Everyone's like, do your research. Because I've been heavily involved in other scientific research unrelated to this, I knew that I needed to go to the source of the actual peer-reviewed medical journals and controlled studies, rather than just use somebody else's version of what the science actually says. So I've read all of what I could was available and accessible in terms of the actual science, so that I wasn't being misled by somebody's interpretation of that science. So yeah, that was my motivation to know the longer we wait, the better it is, in terms of at least allowing this child to develop physically, and then hoping that the brain develops enough that they wake up and realize, oh, actually, maybe this isn't for me. Um, and so I was successful at getting that delay for a while, and then they just continued to press for this medicalization. So at this point, by the time really we reached that conversation, the hormone blockers were off the table, or sorry, the puberty blockers were off the table, thankfully.
But at that point, in grade 10, the puberty is already well on its way. And so that's interesting, because puberty blockers are usually for younger children.
Yeah, so that's what I mean, is that luckily at the point with which we started engaging, and by the time we really got to any meaningful conversation, that the puberty blockers were not relevant.
I see. I misunderstood you.
Yeah.
So now we're only talking about cross-sex hormones.
Yeah, no, so then where we're talking, now we're talking about cross-sex hormones, yeah. So luckily I didn't have to worry about the puberty blocking argument, and what would have come from that. So now we're on to the cross-sex hormone discussion, and in that period of time, I again was dragging my feet on really pushing this forward. I did want my child to know that I'm listening and I care and I support you, but this is something that is a very serious undertaking. So we're not going to go about this, without significant information. And honestly, in my mind, I knew at that point that I was never going to consent to these hormones, the cross-sex hormones. It wasn't going to happen. But at that point, I was just really trying to encourage my child to do research along with me and get the data. So ultimately, what ends up happening is my kid keeps pressing it. So I'm like, okay, let's just go gather some more information. How will we start with that? And that was the naive point in this journey for me, where I, like many people and parents that are now facing this, but just people in the general population that don't necessarily have lived experience, realize everything that they're suggesting in terms of vetting and diagnosing and having these children being seen by psychologists or psychiatrists, having endocrinologists involved, having parental consent. I felt like, okay, well, at least there's some safeguards in place, as weak as they may be, at least we've got that.
So were you referred to doctors? Like, were you going through psychologists and endocrinologists at this point, or was it just requests for cross-sex hormones?
Yeah,
So there's no care.
we actually had already had my kid had already been long off and on over the last number of years been seeing a social worker and a child psychologist for unrelated issues. And oftentimes I would have my child go to the child psychologist just for prophylactically or just to check in. Like we've had other life family events that have occurred unrelated specifically to the child in terms of premature loss in the family, traumatic motor vehicle accident. So we had other things that we were seeing a psychologist for, and of those mental health professionals, that my kid has been seeing for quite a number of years off and on, never once had gender dysphoria come up in the conversation, ever.
Okay.
So this was all completely 100% self-diagnosed by my then 15-year-old, with no previous history with myself, with the social worker, with the child psychologist, with the regular general practitioner that we used, who is a very thorough, good GP, never came up. So suddenly we're now in a position where we're talking about cross-sex hormones out of nowhere. So when we went to see our regular GP, just again, I'm kicking tires. I'm like, okay, we'll go through the process here. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. We'll learn and take it from there, cross that bridge. So the regular GP that we see, of course, said, this is not in my wheelhouse. So he referred us to a different doctor who is a so-called self-proclaimed expert in the field. And that's when things really got bad, because I had a spidey sense about this.
So a GP who claims to be an expert in gender dysphoria?
Yeah.
I imagine?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
No special training, not an endocrinologist, like literally just self-described expert. And when we got the referral, again, I'm on the mindset of I'll just delay, till my kid keeps asking and asking and asking. So we got the referral. I'm like, thank you very much. And we get paperwork immediately after the referral. And I mean, it's pretty interesting that in Canada, you get a referral and you're lucky if you get in within a year. This particular clinic immediately sent paperwork, including a requisition for blood work, a small medical intake form, which in fact I couldn't even fit everything from my family medical history into that form, and a consent form. And I'm like, I'm just coming for a meet and greet. Like what? So I didn't fill it out, and I didn't book an appointment. Well, they kept.
What did the consent form say?
Oh, it was a 4-page consent form that basically said you're being treated for gender dysphoria with cross-sex hormones, and it gave all the reasons that you might be sterilized or you might not, and you might do this.
So that's the informed consent form.
Yeah, but I hadn't had the appointment yet.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I didn't fill out the forms and I didn't book the appointment, and they kept contacting me, asking me when I wanted to come in. And I said, how about I call you? You don't call me. And so that's what I did for a number of months. And then my kid kept asking and asking and asking. So finally, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna take that little baby step. But then when I contacted them, they said, well, we can't book the appointment until you fill out the paperwork. And I said, well, wait a minute. You're asking me to sign a consent form for something for which I haven't been informed. Why would I do that first? And why am I getting a blood requisition done when, once again, this is just a preliminary appointment?
So this was a requirement for that appointment.
That's what they were telling me.
Yeah.
But
so a requirement for an investigative first appointment is blood work and a informed consent for treatment that you have not actually referred to them about.
Yeah. So I said, I'm not signing it. Not doing it. Not doing blood work, not signing the consent form. So the receptionist or nurse or whomever I was speaking with at the clinic said, okay, well, that's okay. We'll book you in and you can sign it when you get here. I said, okay, sure. Let's do that. I was never, ever, ever going to sign this consent form, regardless of what this individual had to say. But we go, and
were you suspicious of anything at this point? Was there any sort of red flag?
Oh yeah, they were all red flags. They were all red flags. But again, I was at a point of naivety where I thought, well, there's only so much this guy can do if I don't consent. What can he do?
Yeah.
So we got to the clinic, and immediately my then 15-year-old was separated from me. And I was told that this was my child's appointment, not mine, and that I would need to wait in the lobby. Again, red flag. So I'm sitting in the lobby thinking, okay, well, like I'll be here, I should be here for a while. I'm sure whatever's going on in that room is my child self-diagnosing, and we'll deal with that when I get in the room. I'm not exaggerating when I say if I was in that lobby more than 5 minutes, I'd be surprised. I got called into the room and I was promptly told that if I had done the blood work, that the doctor would have written the prescription right then and there. And I said,
so basically what that's saying is that doctor is used to that being the procedure, and that's perfectly fine and normal, and you're the one who's making this situation awkward.
And so I said, excuse me, I literally just got here. I'm not sure how we...
At that point, you haven't been told anything. You're not... The doctor hasn't explained anything to you. They haven't gone over anything. The first thing they're saying to you is, well, this would have been done already if you'd done your homework.
Yeah. Yeah. And when I challenged, I said, I literally just sat down. You had a 5-minute conversation with my child, at which point the doctor said, oh, well, your child says that they've been gender dysphoric since the age of 4. I said, what? Since the age of 4? That's news to me. I said, I'm not quite sure why none of the mental health professionals that we have been engaging over the last decade have come up with this diagnosis. So I said, not sure how you've come to that conclusion in a 5-minute appointment, and presumably this child would need parental consent to move forward with any of this. At which point he says to me, if you tried to fight this in court, I would testify on behalf of your child and you would lose.
Oh, so now, okay, so the second stage.
Yeah, yeah. Other parents have tried this and failed.
Wow.
I said, excuse me? I said, how did we go from, hi, I'm here for some general information, to you testifying on behalf of my minor child that you've just met? I'm sorry.
So step 1, how dare you not have the blood work and consent form ready? I've decided that your child has had this illness since they were very young because they said so. And if you try to fight it, we're going to take you to court.
Yeah.
And we've done it before and you're going to lose. Yeah. And this is what you're told by this medical practitioner.
Yeah.
Well,
in front of my child.
I don't know how I would react to that.
Yeah. This did not sit well with me, obviously. And so I said, well, excuse me. I said, I'm still really just here for general information. I said, so if you're suggesting that you're treating my child for gender dysphoria, there's been no diagnosis. And if by default or some sort of miracle that this child is in fact diagnosed with said disorder, what's the mental health protocol here? Because by definition, there should be a mental health screening, there should be mental health support.
Yeah, because if you have, if a child has ADHD, they can't just get a prescription of Adderall. They have to have a diagnosis. Now that process might be very lax. It might be that they go in and get a diagnosis in 5 minutes and just say, look, I have ADHD and that's fine. The papers get signed. But the process is still to have that diagnosis in place because there's a paper trail that doctors need to have to cover themselves, if nothing else, right? So you need to have that. And so in this case, there's absolutely no diagnosis whatsoever. Simply the doctor saying, that that's the case,
No.
and then threatening you.
Yeah. And so when I asked about the mental health piece, I was basically told that there's a community organization here in Calgary that my child could go to. And I said, a community organization, which I won't name any names, but they're problematic. I said, I need psychotherapy for my child. A community support group sitting around a circle is not going to address the problem if there is one. So
a lot of these have adults who are coaching minors as well.
And that's what this is a grooming organization. It really is.
20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, trans-identified people coaching 13-year-old kids and how to be trans. I mean, that's typically what it's like.
That's what this group is. And so I said, I'm sorry, that's just not sufficient. I said, and what are the side effects of these hormones? Oh, they're all reversible. I said, they're all reversible. I said, how is that possible? I said, so he said, well, except for if there's a sufficient amount of breast growth, then you would just have those removed. I said, just have those removed? Like, do you hear the words coming out of your mouth? Because I do. I said, what do you mean? I said, you don't just put tits on a boy and send him on his way. That's not how this works. So I am not an easily intimidated human. I was just so shocked. And I basically said, I'm sorry, I'm not interested in this grift. This is not of interest to me. We will go on the wait list at the Children's Hospital. Again, at least they have some reasonably trained professionals that specialize in this, and I'll use that specialized term loosely. But at this point, I didn't trust anybody.
Yeah.
And so I said, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to move on from here. And so we left.
Just before we move on for that, I'm curious, do you have a sense that when this doctor threatened you that he'd taken people to court in the past and won? Do you have a sense that this is just a threat, or that he had actually fought this and won?
I believe that he's fought this and won, because I do know other people that other people have filed complaints against this doctor and lost. And here's what I believe happened. And I can't corroborate this, but based on my own experience, what I believe happened in all of those other cases, if not, well, maybe not all of them, but I would assume many of them, is that those parents signed the consent form because of the pressure to sign in order to get the appointment. So even if they came back and realized, okay, we're not going to go down that path, he has the consent form that they signed.
Which is probably why he asked for it in the first place. Yes. Wow, very clever.
Yes. And so that's what, because they were very, very, very adamant that I fill this out. In those moments, for most parents, they're terrified. They're like, my kid's going to kill themselves. Oh, sorry. That's what he also said. He used that line on me also. The classic suicidality threat that if this child is not affirmed and does not go on the hormones, then suicidality, dead child, trans child argument came up also. It's pretty textbook, actually, retrospectively. So we left. And even in the car, my kiddo was like, so when can we start? I'm like,
were you not just in the room with me?
No, we can't start. Again, we'll get on the wait list at the Children's, and if this, we'll move through the process. In the meantime, you do what you need to do to express yourself socially, and we'll just see where this goes. So that bought me a little bit more time, a number of months actually, and we did get on the wait list at the Children's. And then while we were still on the wait list, which we actually technically still are, it would be almost 2 years now. Basically, I actually thought that my kid was sort of coming out of this a little bit, because even how they were presenting themselves was not feminine anymore at all. My death got interested in death metal, dressing more goth. Very little about that. My kid was really trans feminine, so he went from trans woman or trans. It's hard to keep track. Like even the identification changed a few times. And so then I was able to get in with the social worker at the children's hospital while we were waiting for the psychiatrist and the endocrinologist appointment. And I thought, okay, well, let's just go kick some tires there because my kid kept sort of pushing to go back to this other doctor. So we went and sat with the children's hospital, and I was a little bit more hopeful that they were going to vet the process a bit better. But in that appointment, I was told that it is not that when I questioned all of the things about the diagnosis, I was told by the social worker at the children's hospital that it is not their job to diagnose these children, it's their job to affirm them. I'm like, pardon me? Like
So how do they get a diagnosis?
Pardon me?
So then how do they get a diagnosis?
Well, it's a self-diagnosis. It's not our job to diagnose them. It's our job to affirm them, is exactly what she said. And I said, well, how does self-diagnosis count?
But what medical treatment do we get from self-diagnosis?
I asked that very same question. I also said that the expression of this child's gender identity had changed even in the year since we first started this. And lo and behold, what does she pull out? The purple unicorn. And I'm like, well, there's gender expression. I'm like, this is hocus pocus. I said, I don't understand how you can actually say this with a straight face.
That a nurse is saying
she's a social worker. This was a social.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So
not as egregious.
Yeah, still. Right. I'm like, oh my god, like this has to be a sick joke. So I thought, thank God that our appointment is no time soon. Still hoping my kid grows out of this before. In the meantime, so we leave there because, again, I was just really trying to do what I could to, make the effort to show my kid that I'm not dismissing all of this completely. I'm not affirming, but I'm also not just completely saying that this is absolute lunacy. I walked that line because I knew well enough with any kind of teenager, you walk that fine line that's tricky.
Yeah.
And so we left there, and so we're still on the wait list. And then fast forward, I thought, okay, this kid's actually kind of moving away from this. And then out of nowhere, I find cross-sex hormones in my child's bedroom.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah. And I look at the pill bottles, and
obviously it's a prescription. Because it's not like the USA. There's no way to call and say, please send me free drugs.
No. This was prescribed by the doctor that threatened me with the lawsuit.
Because that's the only way, as I understand, to get
no, it was prescribed.
Or any kind of HRT. It has to be prescription from a doctor.
Yeah. It was prescribed by that initial doctor that threatened me in the initial appointment.
What a betrayal.
A big betrayal for a lot of reasons, too, because prior to this, my child even was always a rule follower. I've never had conflict with my kid ever until gender ideology came into the equation. My kid during the time with which my kid had gone behind my back to get these drugs, that same child was asking me for permission to go to the library to study at night after school. I'd get a text from him saying, can I go to the library with some friends after school? And it sounds like he was saying that to go somewhere else. He's actually super academically engaged.
I had a very similar experience with my own child and behavior change, which at the time I chalked down to teenage years. Yeah. But I recognize in that what you're saying quite a bit. And I absolutely recognize that.
Incongruent with who this child was prior. Completely incongruent. So when I find these pills that now I'm freaking out. And what I ended up doing was I did take the pills for about a 12-hour period while I thought through what I was going to say. He had just started them. Um, like
So it's just the estrogen at this point. It's not spirulactone as
Yeah, it
well.
is spirulactone as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was both. And, just as an aside, I have two family members who died recently in the last 5 years of genetic heart failure, both epically healthy individuals, my brother and my mom. And that was one of the heart failure drugs that they were on. So none of this is okay.
Spirulactone is used for heart conditions?
Yeah, it's a heart failure
I
medication.
didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. So I was quite familiar with it. So basically, of course, being used off label to suppress testosterone production. Um, anyway, I decided to put the pills back because I thought to myself, this kid's just going to go get more. And I had to sort of strategize how I was going to approach this. And long story short, I presented my kiddo with everything that I could in terms of all that science I had done, emotional approach, intellectual, academic, sociological, everything. It wasn't always an argument, although arguments did occur. But every time I would try to reasonably discuss this with my kid, who's very scientifically minded, uh, I was hit with, "I'll kill myself if I don't take these." That whole narrative, and there was nothing to say to this. This was a vitriol of nonsensical indoctrination.
Were
Because
there any issues with potential like depression or suicidality before?
no, no, but comorbidity wise, he had been diagnosed by the child psychologist, and she was reluctant even to diagnose this because she largely did. It was him that was looking for the diagnosis, not me. With depression, anxiety. So he was being mildly treated for that, like it wasn't severe, but there is a comorbidity there. I never did have him tested or for being on any kind of spectrum disorder, but there certainly is a possibility of that, or personality disorder, something along that. But rightfully so, the child psychologist, once we were down this rabbit hole, she said, there's no point in another diagnosis right now. Like, we've got to focus on the rabbit hole that this child is in right now. And she's not wrong. And that was really good advice, because more diagnosis.
So what did you do about the pills then?
I put them back. I put them back because I realized I had to, it's like you find this. I found cigarettes too. I'm like, who smokes cigarettes anymore? Is that even a thing? Like, so I try not to conflate that decision, and I just made it clear ultimately to him that you're clearly going to do this against my consent. I want you to know that as your mother, I love you, and I want you to be safe, and it's my job to keep you safe. I will not and do not consent to you taking these drugs, and I need you to know that I will always love and support you, but any consequences that come from you taking these drugs are going to be yours to deal with, and yours alone. Meaning the physical ramification of this, it's your body, not mine. Emotionally and otherwise, I will be there for you as your mom, but you're going to be the one living with these consequences, not me. And just remember that I'm not okay with this, but if you're going to continue, there's nothing more I can say to you or do.
Yeah.
And
I mean, that's a fair approach, to be fair.
that's all. Yeah. I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight this for what? For what? My fear was, going underground and getting some source.
Yeah, if you're too confrontational with a teenager, that usually doesn't turn out too well.
They just double down. So I am terrified. I was terrified. That was back in June of 2023. But shortly after that, where I'm like, I'm just going to park this for a while. I'm terrified. I'm losing sleep over it, but I'm not engaging. I'm not arguing about it. I've made all my whole case as clear as I can. And then a few weeks later, oh, in the meantime, I did contact this doctor and had some choice words, and did inform this doctor that this was unethical and not okay. I was met with, well, this is a mature minor situation. I said, no, it's not. No, it's not. That's not the standard of care. That is not the standard of care in Canada for cross-sex hormones. Not even for adults is that the standard of care.
Yeah, this mature minor is a big problem. I seem to be coming across that quite a bit. I have some ideas on that, but yeah, interesting that it came up in this case
Yeah.
as a justification for completely disregarding ethics.
Yeah. And I said, I made it very clear to you that this child has all the.
We have an assessment of whether or not that minor is mature to begin with. It doesn't seem to have been an assessment,
right? That 5-minute appointment doesn't cut it for anything, actually. And so I made it clear to him that that this was not okay, and that he did not solicit the appropriate professionals that were already treating my child prior to this gender identity situation, and that ultimately there will be a complaint filed with the College of Physicians and Surgeons. And I basically told him that and again, he used the argument. He basically said that essentially he felt he was untouchable. And I said, well, I'm coming for you, so
yeah,
you can look for that. And then
he probably is untouchable.
Pardon me?
He probably is untouchable, but very much worth.
He has been untouchable, but I'm not sure he's going to remain untouchable, because there were a number of other things on my complaint. Not just how he treated me and the things he threatened me with, but also when I printed off the consent form, which I never signed. The consent form, by the way, says right on it, if you're under the age of 18, you require parental consent. I'm like, I guess we skip over that piece. But on the consent form, there was actually another patient's name. So he had a breach of confidentiality in the consent form that I was sent. And then when I informed the clinic that they are clearly really not doing a very good job of keeping patients' names confidential, they once again suggested that somehow this was my fault, that I had pressed some button to make this name appear. I said, this is a you problem. This is not a me problem.
Yeah, it seems like somebody who's been getting away with something unethical for a while gets maybe sloppy, and that sounds like that provides some opportunity. So that'll be interesting to know how that turns out.
And it's a cut and paste situation, right? It's a cut and paste is what this is. So
yeah.
So I let him know that the complaint would be forthcoming and that he should look for it. In the meantime, he saw my child on a follow-up appointment because I demanded that the blood work be redone because of the medical history here. He assured me it was going to be done every 3 to 6 months. It was not being done every 3 to 6 months. So I pushed him on that. And at that appointment that my child went to, of course, by himself, the doctor told my then 16-year-old that your mother is trying to take my license, and in order for you to not receive the life-saving hormones for which you're being prescribed.
I don't even have words for that.
There aren't words for that.
Using your child.
Yeah. Told my 16-year-old, and also repeated, other parents have tried and not succeeded. These are the words that my kid came home and told me that this doctor said. I said, where are the ethics in that? First of all, that is between the adults in the room. First of all, let's start.
But this also begs the question, what this individual's particular interest in doing this so, like, I mean, in such a pointed fashion, there's something going, it just feels like there's something going on there, whatever that is, I don't know, but yeah, well, that's odd.
You separate the children from their parents. That's what this is really, the movement.
Yeah, but why would a doctor have interest in doing that? Why would a doctor have interest in threatening parents and then threatening them again via the minor itself, the child, declaring mature minors that are not assessed in any way. Like it just feels like there's just something else going on with this individual doctor. Whatever, we can speculate whatever that is, but it just feels a bit sinister.
Well, and I think there's a God complex in this. I think there is this sort of psychopathic belief I think this doctor thinks that he's saving these children from something, that he's the savior of these poor, abused trans kids because their parents just don't understand. It's very complex, but yes, this individual, by the way, this doctor has been doing this not just in the trans world, but also in terms of psychotherapy drugs. In our outreach clinics here, I know that I can corroborate this is something that he's been doing, not just with cross-sex hormones, but with other drugs prescribing to children without parental consent.
So what's the situation now?
Well, since the doctor told my child that very thing, my kid ran away and screamed at me and said, I'll never forgive you for doing this. Without these hormones, I'd be dead." And he left. And so now we are at a point where shortly after he left, we did go to sort of circle back with the therapist. And at that therapy appointment, when the child said, "I am no longer living at home because I'm not safe," and the therapist, who luckily again has a history with our family, says, what makes you not safe? And initially he couldn't answer the question. And then when pressed a little further, when I said, "Well, other than, your gender identity, when have you and I ever had conflict?" And even in that, we've had a couple of verbal arguments, like literally maybe 4 arguments over this. I tried other tact, right? I knew getting into the argument, but even if we fought all the time, it wasn't abusive fighting. It was just discussion surrounding the concerns that I had. And in order for my child to justify the decisions that he's now made, he accused me of abusing him.
And he's obviously getting that from the adults around him, or possibly online, or possibly school. I mean, there's so many different places where young people caught up in this can get those ideas, right? Like, the fact that your kid is saying, "If I don't have these drugs, I am going to kill myself." I mean, I don't know. It could be that, I don't know your child. It could be that they're just saying that to get their way, but it could also be that they actually really, really believe that. I think, and so if you can believe that, if somebody can make you believe that you're going to kill yourself, then if your parents are saying, "No, you can't have these medicines, it's not good for you," then I can understand why that child would then think, "I am being abused by my parents because my parents want me dead."
Yeah. And that is the script and the narrative that they're being fed. And it's like having a conversation with somebody that's been so indoctrinated by these mistruths, not only in terms of the physical potential side effects of these drugs, but also the mistruths surrounding the psychological piece that, and it just simply isn't true. But you can't have that argument with somebody that's so deep into the ideology.
Well, we used to not talk about suicide or not announce all this suicide. So, for example, I don't know about in Canada, but I know in the tube in London, they try not to announce when people have jumped onto the line, because when they do, more people jump on the line.
Yes.
And so there's this idea around suicide that it's not that we're trying to hide it as a taboo, but they notice that if you talk to people about methods of suicide, it encourages other people to do the same. There's this phenomenon around advertising suicide, right? And so the funny thing is about trans is that line is, especially now, we've seen after the Danielle Smith policy announcement, all these trans activists, the biggest thing that we're hearing all the time is how all these kids are going to kill themselves. And, some young people who might have issues, comorbidities, maybe are prone to those things. That is a potential issue, because often these are vulnerable children who fall into this in the first place. But there's a lot of them who are going to absorb that idea. I mean, it's the same thing 10, 20 years ago with bulimia, with anorexia, with young girls. The more that it's discussed, the more that it's shared, the more contagious it becomes. And so there's this idea. I mean, I think it's a shame. And I don't believe that all of these social scientists are not aware of the phenomenon of suicide being catchy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they must be aware of that. I mean, for the politicians, I'm not so sure. Maybe the educators, I'm not so sure. But these psychologists and sociologists and people in the humanities, I would imagine they know about this phenomena, and that I can't imagine you would make the cognitive leap that, well, that phenomena exists everywhere else except in trans. And so for one reason or another in trans, we have to talk about this all the time. We have to tell kids how unsafe they are all the time. We have to tell them they're going to kill themselves, that their parents are bigots. And, that absolutely baffles me. And I can't help but feel like in your case, there's a very strong element of that going on.
A very, very, very strong, and you can just hear it in the language. It's verbatim, like they're all saying the exact same thing. And when challenged with anything that's outside of the script, they can't answer the question. Um, and so,
well, you're a bigot. You don't talk to
you're
bigots.
a bigot. You're a TERF. You're this or that. You're whatever. And so where
so do you have like a positive feeling of the future?
I do actually, because as I mentioned earlier, my kid is very, very, very academically motivated, and even though I am no longer, because he's getting funding from our government because he's not safe at home. And I've been cut off from the school information, but because he really, really, really enjoys academics, that is his priority. And I did start to reach out a little bit, even after, it took me a few months after the accusations to realize that right now my child is suffering with some kind of a mental health issue surrounding the ideology and whatever else he's got himself into. And I needed to make sure that I still reminded myself that I'm still the mom and I'm still the adult in the room. And so I've kept breadcrumbs that I'm leading him back, because I do feel that he didn't quite plan on getting himself into this situation. And I think he does need to know that there's a way out. And I have been able to have a conversation with him in this last few weeks that have gone very, very well. And he is very, he'll be off to university in, 6 months or so here.
Yeah, I feel like as long as your child is in a system that will reinforce the idea that you, the parent, are unsafe and you, the parent, are wanting them dead, basically.
Yeah.
Like, so long as they're in that system, and potentially even the educational system also repeating that message, you poor thing,
Yeah.
Your parents have done this to you. I think it would be very difficult to possibly lead them out of that mindset. But, in the long run, they're not always going to be in school, right? They're going to have to go into the wider society at some point, and there's some hope there. Because when you're surrounded by different people who have different ideas, sometimes I think that can maybe help.
Well, and luckily he is going into organic chemistry, which is not necessarily, I would consider, a super affirming transgender environment. They're not going to be bigotry there. There's not going to be bigotry there necessarily, but it's just not going to be a daily reinforcement, because they're focused on
like they're going into gender studies.
Yeah, right. Or fine arts, or some other area where the glitter family can really continue to take a hold. That shift, I actually have great hope will definitely make a difference. And then in the meantime, I'm just going to make sure he knows that I love him, and I've stepped out of the ring. I'm not fighting anymore. I'm not talking about gender ideology anymore. I've said what I need to say, not a subject matter I'm interested in engaging in. And yes, I definitely support what I did not vote UCP. I was not a fan or supporter of Danielle Smith, but I can tell you that I absolutely 100% get behind what she's doing. And that if her policies had come in even back in the spring of 2023, my child would not be here right now doing what he's doing.
It sounds like you've been really quite reasonable throughout all of this, trying to juggle very complicated things.
Yeah.
And do you think it's so? We'll just wrap it up a little bit now. I realize we've we've had a really great conversation, but before we end, do you think that there's something that you could share with another parent or that might be going through this? Because I feel like you had enough awareness early on to recognize some red flags. But is there something that you think other parents who are potentially going through something like this, or even who haven't, who might want to be aware of things going on? Is there something you'd like to share?
Yeah, and it's kind of hard because I do see a lot of parents out there trying to share their experience, and because every situation is so different. I definitely want to be cautious not to say, well, because this worked for somebody else or it might be working for me, that it's going to work for you. But I will say that I think on the most basic level is you the biggest piece of this is that they're looking to fight with you. And the most progress that I've made so far in this journey is when I decided to step out of the ring. And keep in mind, my kid is a teenager. If your child is much younger, that's a wholly different story. But if you're dealing with a teenager in this situation, the way that I went into this in order to bridge this gap more recently is that if I step out of the ring, then you're left fighting by yourself. And so the only person that you're fighting with is you, and that becomes a you problem. And if you're not getting the pushback, then you're going to have to look around the ring and wonder, why am I shadowboxing with myself? And you're going to have to figure out what that's about. So really the pushback, make sure that you stand your ground on what you're consenting to and what you're not. And the suicidal, threat is terrifying, but I don't let that change what you know to be right, because I'm telling you that cross-sex hormones are not. If your child is suicidal, there are bigger issues here than estrogen or testosterone. So just try to take a step back. Try not to buy into the gaslighting, and educate yourself. Make sure you know what you're talking about, not just what the news tells you or what you may read, what you Google. You do have to do a deep dive in order to be educated. And no one size fits all. It's terrifying. It's terrifying. And also, like, you're good parents, because we beat ourselves up thinking, what could I have done differently? Am I a terrible parent? And in most cases, you're not. You're just not. This is bigger than us. But I think we are. I think we are on the precipice of change. And hopefully, future generations will be saved from this trauma that we currently find ourselves in.
Well, your story is absolutely eye-opening. I feel like it's, you couldn't make it up. It's absolutely couldn't make it up. And given all the attention on Alberta right now, certainly here in Ontario, I know we're looking at Alberta, seeing how that turns out, and hoping that leads the rest of the country, because I know it's positioned as far right, and possibly because, or at least the position on the trans policy positioned as far right extremism, and it could be because the country is so used to far left extremism that anything that is sensible, that would have been seen as sensible even just a few years ago before all this, is viewed as far right extremism. But it is sensible. I think that it respects that some parents are going to want to do this with their child, and that's going to be okay for their children. It's not saying nobody can do it ever under whatever reason. It seems to be quite a reasonable thing to do. So we certainly look to Alberta, and it'd be interesting to see how everything develops. But I'm really, really grateful that you spent the time telling me in detail about what's been going on with you. And maybe we'll have you on another time to see how it develops. But thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.